The year of our Lord, 1876, and the Arizona Territory was a skillet sizzling under a brass sun. Heat shimmered up from the red earth, making the distant mesas tremble. Giant saguaro cacti stood like silent, multi-armed sentinels, their shadows shrinking to nothing as the sun climbed toward its zenith. High above the salt Gila Valley, buzzards carved lazy circles in a sky the color of faded denim, their eyes fixed on the world below, waiting for something to die. This was a land that did not offer easy comfort. It demanded respect and resilience, and it gave little in return but a stark, brutal beauty. It was a land of sharp edges, of things that could prick or bite or poison. Evelyn Hart understood this. She felt the dry wind on her face, a constant, warm breath that carried the scent of dust and creosote. It pulled at the stray strands of brown hair that had escaped her bun and whipped the hem of her practical riding skirt against the flanks of her steady mule. Solomon. She was returning to the small, dusty settlement of Dry Creek after setting the broken arm of a rancher's boy 10 miles out. Her leather satchel, filled with laudanum, carbolic acid, and clean linen bandages, felt heavy on her shoulder. At 28, Evelyn was the town's schoolteacher, but by necessity and by training back east, she was also its only doctor. Her hands, though slender and pale, were deft and sure. They could soothe a fevered brow, stitch a ragged wound, and command the attention of a classroom full of restless children with equal competence. She had a gentle face, but her blue eyes saw things with a clarity that often made people uncomfortable. They saw the truth beneath the bluster, the fear behind the anger. Solomon plodded onward, his ears twitching. He stopped suddenly, planting his hooves. Evelyn patted his neck. "What is it, boy?" She followed his gaze. The buzzards. They were circling lower now, just beyond a shallow, dried-out arroyo. A cold knot formed in her stomach. It was a common enough sight, a coyote or a sick calf finally succumbing to the heat. But something made her dismount. She tethered Solomon to a gnarled mesquite tree and proceeded on foot, her boots sinking slightly into the coarse, red sand. The heat was a physical weight. As she neared the edge of the wash, the metallic smell of blood hit her, thick and cloying. There, half hidden by the parched brush, was a man. He lay face down, his dark hair matted with blood and dirt. One arm was flung out, the other twisted beneath him. His deerskin shirt was soaked through with a dark stain that had spread across his back. He was Apache. She could tell by his high cheekbones, the set of his jaw, and the beaded moccasins on his feet. He was also dying. Evelyn knelt, her medical instincts overriding any sense of caution. She gently rolled him over. A ragged groan escaped his lips. His face was a mask of grime and pain, but it was a strong face. She saw a flicker of consciousness in his dark eyes before they clouded over again. She pressed her fingers to his neck. His pulse was weak, thready. The wound was high on his left shoulder, a bullet hole, ugly and raw. He was losing blood far too quickly. And then she saw his face clearly, beneath the blood and dirt. Her breath caught in her throat. She had seen this man before. His likeness, crudely drawn but unmistakable, was nailed to the notice board outside the sheriff's office. The poster promised $500 for the capture, dead or alive, of an Apache renegade named Kohana. The crimes listed beneath the drawing were stark armed robbery, cattle rustling, kidnapping. He was, according to the paper signed by Sheriff Cole, a menace to every decent citizen in the territory. Evelyn's mind raced. To help him was to break the law. To harbor a wanted fugitive was a crime. Dry Creek was a nervous town, easily spooked. The talk lately was all of Apache raids, of barns burned in the night and livestock stolen. The fear was a poison being dripped into the town's ear, and the source of that poison, she knew, was Silas Crowley. Crowley owned the biggest cattle ranch in the valley, and he had a grip on Dry Creek that was as tight as a hangman's noose. He had the sheriff in his pocket, and his ambition was as vast as the territory itself. He wanted land, more land, especially the lands to the east, toward the mountains, where the Apache tribes considered the ground sacred. The posters, the fear, the so-called raids, they had all started when the railroad surveyors began their work. Crowley was a partner in the venture, a fact he made no secret of. He spoke of progress and prosperity, but his eyes held the cold glint of greed. He wanted the Apache gone, and he was using every tool at his disposal, including fear and lies, to make it happen. He had offered a bounty for any red savage found off the reservation, turning neighbor against neighbor and filling the saloons with rough men eager for easy money. Evelyn looked down at the man at her feet. Kohana, the name on the poster, a name whispered with fear in the town, but the man before her was not a monster. He was a human being, bleeding his life into the thirsty sand. Her oath as a healer, the simple, profound creed to preserve life wherever she found it, warred with the instinct for self-preservation. She looked up at the circling birds, then back at the unconscious man. The choice was not a choice at all. With a strength she did not know she possessed, she managed to get him onto his feet, draping his good arm over her shoulders. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. Staggering, she half dragged, half carried him to the mule. Getting him onto Solomon's back was an ordeal that left her gasping for breath, her muscles screaming in protest. She led the mule away from the main trail, taking a longer, more circuitous route back to the edge of town, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Her small adobe house stood behind the schoolhouse, slightly apart from the main street. It offered a measure of privacy, with immense difficulty. She got him inside and onto the narrow cot in her small spare room, the one she used for patients. She lit a lamp as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. She worked quickly, her hands sure and steady. She cut away the deerskin shirt, cleaned the wound with carbolic acid, and grimaced. The bullet was still in there, lodged deep. Probing for it would be agony for him, and dangerous. For now, all she could do was stop the bleeding and fight the fever that was already beginning to set in. She packed the wound with clean linen and bound it tightly. She forced some water mixed with willow bark tea between his lips. He swallowed weakly, his eyes still closed. Later that evening, as she sat watching him, a frantic banging on her main door made her jump. It was Jed, one of Crowley's ranch hands. He and another man were carrying a third, a rough-looking character whose name she thought was Finn. He was bleeding from a deep gash in his side, the result of a drunken knife fight at the El Coyote saloon. She directed them to lay him on her examination table in the main room. "He's bad, Dr. Hart," Jed said, his voice shaky. "Real bad." She worked on Finn for an hour, stitching the wound as best she could, but the man had lost too much blood. He was pale and his breathing was shallow. He died on her table just before midnight, muttering something about a pass and a map. The other two men, sobered by the sight of death, helped her move the body to the floor and cover it with a sheet. They would send the undertaker in the morning. After they left, the silence of the house was profound, exhausted. Evelyn began to clean up. As she unbuttoned Finn's dusty vest to straighten his clothes, her fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper in his inner pocket. Curious, she pulled it out. It was a surveyor's map, drawn in neat, precise lines. It detailed a route for a new railroad spur, a route that cut straight through the foothills to the east. And there, circled in red ink, was a narrow canyon labeled Copper Pass. Copper Pass. The name echoed in her memory. She had heard it spoken in hushed tones by the few Apache women who sometimes came to the edge of town to trade. It was a sacred place for them, a place of spirits and ancestors. And according to this map, it was about to be blasted open to make way for a railroad that would make Silas Crowley an even richer and more powerful man. Finn's dying words clicked into place. She now held the proof of Crowley's motive. This was never about stolen cattle. It was about this land, this pass, A low groan from the other room reminded her of the man on the cot. She tucked the map safely into a medical textbook on her shelf and went to check on him. He was awake. His eyes were open, and they were fixed on her, sharp and intelligent, filled with a caution that bordered on hostility. He was a former scout for the army, she had heard, a man who had walked in the white man's world only to turn his back on it. He was caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. She brought him a cup of water. "You need to drink," she said softly. He pushed himself up slightly, wincing in pain. "Where am I?" His voice was a low rasp. "You are safe, for now," she answered. "You were shot. I am a doctor. I am helping you." His eyes narrowed. "Why?" It was a simple question, but the answer was complicated. "Because it is my duty to help the sick and injured. It does not matter who they are." A faint, cynical smile touched his lips. Even a wanted man. "So he knew. The poster says you are a criminal. But this map," she hesitated, then decided to trust him. "This map I found tonight tells me you are just in the way." Before he could respond, a new sound reached them from outside, the baying of hounds. A shiver of fear ran down Evelyn's spine. The dogs were followed by the sound of horses and the low murmur of men's voices. A posse. They were searching for him. She moved quickly, her mind clear and focused. "Stay here. Do not make a sound." She blew out the lamp in his room, plunging it into darkness, then went to her front window and peered through the curtains. A group of riders, led by Sheriff Cole, was slowly making its way down the street. Lanterns held high, the hounds sniffing and whining at the edge of the trail. Her choice was made. She would not let them find him. She would not stand by and let Crowley's scheme succeed. After the posse passed, moving toward the arroyo where she had found him, she slipped out her back door into the moonless night. She moved silently through the shadows, a ghost in her own town. She reached the crossroads at the edge of Dry Creek. One sign pointed east, toward the foothills. The other pointed south. With some effort, she wrenched the post from the dry ground and switched them, pointing the posse in the wrong direction. But the dogs were another matter. Their noses would not be so easily fooled. She remembered a trick an old trapper had once told her. From her satchel, she pulled a small cloth bag containing asafoetida, a foul-smelling herb she used in some remedies. She dragged the bag behind her, crossing and recrossing the trail leading away from her house, laying down a scent so powerful it would confuse any hound. She returned to her house as the first hint of dawn was breaking in the east. She was bone-tired but filled with a strange, fierce energy. She stood at her window, looking out over the sleeping town. In the far, far distance, a sound she had never heard before reached her, faint and mournful. It was the whistle of a train, testing the new line. As she watched, the morning wind picked up, lifting the red dust from the street. It spun and danced, growing into a miniature whirlwind, a dust devil that twisted its way across the barren land before dissolving into nothing. It was an omen. A storm was coming, a storm of dust and lies and violence, and she was standing directly in its path. By morning, Dry Creek was a pot of coffee beginning to boil. The sun beat down on the dusty main street, a wide, rutted expanse of red dirt flanked by a collection of weathered wooden buildings. At one end stood the El Coyote Saloon, its bat-wing doors already swinging as men sought liquid courage to face the day or simply to gossip about the night's failed manhunt. At the other end, the simple timber frame of the town church pointed a stark white steeple toward the unforgiving sky, a silent testament to a higher law that seemed very far away. Smack in the middle, exuding an air of self-importance, was the office of Sheriff Matthew Cole, a man whose loyalty was not to the tin star on his chest, but to the gold coin in his pocket, a coin that always bore the mark of Silas Crowley. Inside that office, Deputy Rosa Valdez polished the barrel of her Colt Peacemaker, the rhythmic motion of the cloth a small, steady counterpoint to the nervous energy in the room. Rosa was a woman forged by the territory, with dark, intelligent eyes that missed nothing and hands that could draw and fire with a speed that startled men who underestimated her. She had a conscience, a quality that was becoming a heavier burden each day she served under Cole. She watched him now as he paced, his face florid, his movements agitated. They vanished. "Rosa, just vanished," Cole grumbled, running a hand through his thinning hair. "The dogs lost the scent completely. It's like the earth just swallowed him up." "Or someone was clever," Rosa said quietly, not looking up from her work. "That Apache, Kohana, he was a scout for the army. He knows how to disappear." "He had help," Cole snapped. "That's what Crowley says, and I believe him." He stopped pacing and stared out the window at the townspeople gathering in small, anxious knots. Silas is going to address the town. He has evidence. Proof that it was Kohana's band that burned down Miller's hay barn last week. Rosa's hands stilled. She knew Silas Crowley's evidence was as real as a mirage in the desert heat. It was manufactured, designed to stoke a fire of fear that was already smoldering. Across the street, Reverend Avery stood on the porch of his small rectory, watching the same scene unfold. He was a tall, stooped man with a mane of white hair and a face etched with the lines of a long, observant life. He had seen towns like this rise from the dust and had seen them fall into moral ruin. He saw Evelyn Hart emerge from her house, her face pale but composed, and he nodded to her with a look of profound respect. When she had first arrived, a prim and proper schoolteacher from back east, he had wondered if she had the grit to survive out here. He no longer wondered. He had seen the steel in her spine. As he watched the crowd drift toward the sheriff's office, he murmured to himself a phrase he often used in his sermons. "Justice is not the ink on a piece of paper. My friends, it is the person brave enough to sign their name to it." The crowd swelled as Silas Crowley stepped onto the porch of the sheriff's office, Sheriff Cole at his side looking like a nervous understudy. Crowley was a large man, dressed in a fine but practical suit, his presence commanding. He held up a blackened, splintered arrow shaft for all to see. "This was found in the ashes of Miller's barn," Crowley announced, his voice booming across the street. "This is an Apache arrow. This is their work. They are testing us, seeing how far they can push before we push back. They steal our cattle, they burn our property, and the wanted man Kohana, their leader, is still at large, likely hiding among us, being aided by some sympathizer." A low murmur of anger went through the crowd. "Sheriff Cole has done his best," Crowley continued, placing a patronizing hand on the sheriff's shoulder. "But this threat requires more. I am renewing my offer, a bounty. $100 for any hostile brave brought to justice. It is time we formed our own company of regulators. It is time we took our safety into our own hands." The murmur grew into a cheer. Men who had been simple farmers and merchants an hour before were now puffing out their chests, imagining themselves as Indian fighters, as heroes. From her window, Evelyn heard it all. Her stomach churned. She was a good citizen. She had been raised to respect the law, to believe in the order and structure of society. But the law in Dry Creek was a sham, a tool of a greedy man. Her duty as a citizen was telling her to turn Kohana in. But her conscience, the oath she had taken as a healer, screamed that it was murder. She was caught in a vice, squeezed between what was legal and what was right. She turned from the window and went into the small room where Kohana lay. The fever had not broken, but it had not worsened. He was asleep, his breathing shallow. She gently cleaned and redressed his wound, her movements efficient and gentle. As she worked, she felt a profound sense of isolation. In this town, at this moment, she was utterly alone. Kohana was not always asleep. In his moments of lucidity, he would lie perfectly still, his senses taking in his surroundings. Through the small, grimy window of the room, he had a narrow view of an alleyway and a portion of the town well. He watched the life of the town in small, disconnected scenes. He saw two young boys, one white, one Mexican, laughing as they chased a hoop with a stick. They did not seem to notice the color of each other's skin. They were just boys, finding joy in a simple game. Then he saw an old Apache woman, her back bent with age, approach the public well with a clay jar. Before she could lower the bucket, a burly ranch hand shoved her roughly aside. "Get out of here," the man snarled. "This water is for white folks?" The woman stumbled away, her jar empty, her dignity stripped from her. Kohana closed his eyes, a fire of cold fury burning in his chest. This was the world Crowley was building. Later that day, Evelyn was called away. One of the men who had been at the Miller barn fire was coughing up smoke and ash, his lungs raw. She went to his small house near the edge of town, not far from the burned-out structure. After treating the man, she walked over to the ruins, drawn by a morbid curiosity. The place smelled of cinders and defeat. She poked through the blackened debris with the toe of her boot, her mind on Crowley's arrow. It was too easy, too convenient. And then she saw it, a small glint of metal in the gray ash. She knelt and brushed the soot away. It was a piece of a spur, the rowel and shank broken from the heel band. It was made of cast steel, with a distinctive star pattern on the rowel. It was an American spur, the kind a cavalryman or a well-equipped mercenary might wear. It was not something an Apache warrior, who rode with a simple leather loop or a bare heel, would ever use. Her heart began to beat faster. She picked up the broken piece, wrapped it in her handkerchief, and slipped it into her pocket. It was not much, but it was another piece of the truth. That evening, she was changing the dressing on Kohana's wound again. He was awake and alert, the fever having receded slightly. He watched her every move, his expression unreadable. As she cleaned the edges of the wound, he flinched, his jaw tightening. "If you keep wincing like that, you will pop these stitches," she said, her voice a little sharper than she intended. She was tired and on edge. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than pain or suspicion in his eyes. It might have been humor. "I wince," he said, his voice still rough but clear, "because your needle feels like a war lance." Evelyn paused, a small smile touching her own lips despite herself. "And here I was thinking I had a gentle touch. My apologies. I will try to use it more like a sewing needle and less like a weapon from now on." The brief moment of connection was shattered by a knock at the door. It was not the frantic banging of an emergency, but a solid, official rap. Evelyn's blood ran cold. She motioned for Kohana to be silent, though it was unnecessary. He had already become as still and silent as a shadow. She went to the door and opened it a crack. It was Sheriff Cole. He was not alone. Two of Crowley's brutish ranch hands stood behind him, their hands resting on the pistols at their belts. "Good evening, Dr. Hart," Cole said, his voice attempting a friendly tone that did not reach his eyes. "Sorry to bother you so late." "Sheriff," she said, keeping her voice even, "is something wrong?" "Just a routine matter. Some folks are saying some strange things. Rumors. You know how they are." He shifted his weight, unable to meet her gaze directly. "Talk of you being out late last night. Talk of you buying more supplies than usual. People are just concerned. I am a doctor, sheriff. My work often takes me out at all hours, and I am always in need of supplies. I fail to see what concern this is to anyone." Cole finally looked at her, his expression hardening. "There's a rumor, Evelyn, that you are harboring a fugitive, that you are giving aid and comfort to the Apache." "Kohana," he took a deep breath. "I have a duty to investigate. I need to search your home and your clinic." The words hung in the air between them. Behind her, in the darkness of the small back room, a man's life hung in the balance. In front of her stood the corrupted law of Dry Creek. Evelyn stood her ground, her hand gripping the edge of the door, her mind racing. The time for choices was over. The storm had arrived at her doorstep. For a long moment, Evelyn Hart stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The sheriff's accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Behind him, the two ranch hands shifted, their smug expressions confirming this was no friendly visit. This was an inquisition. "Sheriff," she said, her voice betraying none of the fear she felt, "you are welcome to search my clinic, where I treat the sick. You will find medicines, bandages, and the lingering scent of carbolic acid. But my home is private. You will not enter it without a warrant signed by a judge." Cole's face reddened. He had expected her to crumble. "A warrant? We do not stand on such ceremony out here. Dr. Hart, not when the safety of the town is at stake." He placed his hand on the door, intending to push it open. But before he could move, a low rumble echoed in the distance, a sound that was not quite thunder. The air grew still and heavy, charged with an unseen energy. A gust of wind suddenly rattled the window panes, carrying with it the distinct, earthy smell of rain on parched soil. A jagged fork of lightning illuminated the sky, followed a second later by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The men on the porch flinched. The first drops of rain, fat and heavy, began to fall, kicking up little puffs of red dust where they landed. Within moments, the drops became a torrent, a relentless, deafening downpour that turned the street to a slick of mud. The monsoon had arrived, not with a gentle warning, but with the sudden, violent fury of an ambushed predator. "This is not over," Cole shouted over the roar of the rain. Pulling his hat down low, he and his men backed away, their bravado washed away by the sheer force of the storm, and retreated into the relative dryness of the saloon. Evelyn closed the door, her knees weak with relief. She leaned against the solid wood, listening to the storm rage. It had saved her, for now. She went to the back room. Kohana was sitting up, his expression grim. He had heard everything. "They will be back," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she answered, "when the rain stops." But the rain did not stop. It fell all through the night and into the next day. A solid gray sheet of water. Dry Creek, aptly named for 360 days of the year, was transformed. The main street became a shallow, fast-moving river of red mud. The arroyo where Evelyn had found Kohana was now a churning, brown torrent, tearing at its banks. The sound of the rain was a constant, drumming roar, punctuated by the angry growl of thunder. Sometime in the afternoon, the church bell began to clang frantically, a desperate, discordant sound that cut through the noise of the storm. Evelyn looked out her window. A man was stumbling through the mud, shouting, his words snatched away by the wind. She grabbed her oilskin slicker and hurried outside. It was Henry Miller, the man whose barn had burned. His face was a mask of terror. "It's the bridge!" he screamed at a small group of people huddled under the awning of the general store. "The bridge over the pass. A family of migrants. The Schmidts. They tried to cross. Their wagon is stuck, right in the middle." A collective gasp went through the small crowd. The wooden bridge over Copper Pass was old and rickety in the best of times, with the creek beneath it now a raging flood. It was a death trap. "We cannot get to them," Miller cried, his voice breaking. "The road is washed out on this side." Evelyn's mind flew to the treacherous, little-known goat trail that wound through the rocks above the main road. It would be slick and dangerous, but it might be passable. She turned to go back to her house, to get her medical bag, and ran squarely into Kohana. He stood in the doorway, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, his face pale but his eyes clear and intense. "I know a way," he said simply, his voice low but carrying over the din. "Through the rocks. We can get above them." There was no time to argue, no time to consider the risk of revealing him. "A family was in danger. Let's go," she said. The townspeople stared, their mouths agape, as the schoolteacher and the wanted Apache fugitive moved as one, disappearing into the driving rain. The path was barely a path at all, a narrow ledge of slippery rock and loose shale. The wind tore at them, trying to rip them from their handholds. Kohana moved with a sure-footed grace that defied his injury, testing each step before putting his weight down. He pointed out handholds for Evelyn, his presence a steady, calming force against the chaos of the storm. Her lungs burned, and her muscles ached, but she followed without complaint. They emerged onto a rocky outcrop that overlooked the bridge. The scene below was terrifying. The Schmidt family's covered wagon was trapped in the center of the sagging, groaning structure. The creek, a brown monster, churned and roared, slamming whole trees against the bridge's support timbers. "Mister!" Schmidt was frantically trying to calm his panicked horses, while his wife huddled in the back of the wagon, clutching two small children. The bridge shuddered, and a section of the railing splintered and was washed away. They had only minutes. "The ropes," Kohana said, pointing to the harnesses on the horses. "If we can cut them free, the wagon might hold." "They will never leave the children," Evelyn shouted back. He nodded, his mind working. "Then we have to secure the wagon." He looked around, then began uncoiling the long lariat that had been looped over his good shoulder. It was not long enough. He looked at Evelyn, then at the thick leather reins Solomon the mule wore, which she had slung over her shoulder out of habit. He gestured, and she understood, quickly unbuckling them and handing them over. With nimble fingers, he knotted the lariat and the reins together, creating a much longer rope. He found two heavy, fist-sized rocks and tied them to one end, fashioning a crude set of bolas. Down below, one of the main support timbers cracked with a sound like a pistol shot. The wagon lurched violently to one side, hanging half off the edge. Misses. Schmidt screamed. There was no more time. Evelyn did not even think. She just acted. She scrambled down the last few feet of rock face, her heart in her throat. "I'm going to them," she yelled to Kohana. Before he could stop her, she took a running start and leaped. It was not a long jump, but with the wet, splintering wood and the raging torrent below, it was the most terrifying act of her life. She landed hard on the canvas roof of the wagon, skidding on the wet surface but managing to grab hold of a wooden hoop. "Dr. Hart, Mister," Schmidt cried, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Get your family ready to move," she commanded, her voice steady. Above them, Kohana stood poised on the outcrop. He began to swing the makeshift bolas, a blur of leather and rock. He took a deep breath, his eyes narrowed in concentration. And then he threw. The rope snaked through the air, a perfect, elegant arc against the gray sky. The rocks wrapped themselves around the wagon's rear axle, just as he had intended. He dug his heels into the mud, wrapping the other end of the rope around a sturdy rock formation. Pulling the line taut, the wagon, which had been sliding toward the abyss, was momentarily anchored. It was then that Rosa Valdez arrived. She had seen the commotion and had ridden out. Her instincts telling her something was wrong, she reined in her horse at the edge of the washout, and she saw it all. She saw Dr. Hart on top of a teetering wagon. She saw the Schmidt family, white with terror, and she saw the Apache fugitive, Kohana, the man she was supposed to be hunting, his body straining as he held the rope that was the family's only lifeline, his face a mask of fierce determination. He was not a monster. He was a savior. The foundation of lies she had been standing on began to crack. The horses, spooked beyond control, suddenly surged forward. The harnesses snapped, the animals plunged into the flood, and were swept away. The sudden release of tension sent the wagon skidding backward. The rope Kohana held went slack, and then snapped tight with a jerk that nearly pulled his wounded shoulder from its socket. He cried out in pain, but did not let go. The wagon stabilized, now held only by Kohana's rope. "Now," he yelled, "get them out!" Evelyn helped Mrs. Schmidt and the two children out of the back of the wagon and onto the relatively stable part of the bridge. Mr. Schmidt followed, and together they scrambled to the safety of the far bank, just as the last child was clear. The bridge gave a final, soul-wrenching groan and collapsed, the wagon plunging into the churning water and disappearing from sight. They were safe. Evelyn sank to her knees, Shaking, the adrenaline leaving her as suddenly as it had come, the little Schmidt boy, no older than 5, stared at her with wide, wondering eyes. "Are you a witch?" he asked in a small voice. Evelyn managed a weak smile. "No, dear," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "A doctor, though sometimes, with a needle. I suppose I am a bit of a witch." Later, as the rain softened to a drizzle, they stood on the bank, a strange collection of survivors. Rosa had found a way across farther downstream and had joined them. Her eyes kept moving to Kohana, who stood apart, his face drawn with pain and exhaustion. His internal battle was as fierce as the storm had been. He did not want to be here. He did not want to be involved with these people, with their town and their laws. But the words of his grandmother echoed in his mind, a gentle but insistent whisper. A debt of water must always be repaid. This woman, this doctor, had saved his life. He had owed her a debt. Perhaps now it was paid. As the floodwaters began to recede, a strange object was revealed, half buried in the mud near the collapsed bridge. It was a wooden barrel. The water had washed away much of the grime, revealing a stenciled mark on its side, Sea Ranch. It was a barrel of coal tar, the same kind of accelerant that would have been used to turn a barn fire into an inferno. Evelyn's eyes met Rosa's. No words were needed. Here was another piece of the puzzle, washed clean by the very storm that had threatened to destroy them all. It was a direct link between Crowley's ranch and the fire. Evelyn knew what she had to do. With Rosa's help, she wrestled the heavy barrel from the mud and began the arduous task of rolling it back toward Dry Creek. She had the broken spur. She had the surveyor's map. And now she had this. She had evidence. But as she struggled with the barrel, a cold certainty settled over her. Evidence was a threat, and a man like Silas Crowley did not tolerate threats. He eliminated them. The storm had passed, but she knew, with a chilling clarity, that the real danger had just begun. The return to Dry Creek with a tar barrel was a silent, grim affair. The drizzle had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet earth and sage. But the clean scent could not wash away the ugliness that had been exposed. Rosa Valdez, her face set like stone, helped Evelyn roll the heavy barrel into a small shed behind the clinic, out of sight. The deputy's loyalty had shifted, the line between her duty and her conscience finally erased by the flood. She was no longer Sheriff Cole's deputy. She was an officer of a truer law. "Cole is Crowley's man, through and through," Rosa said, her voice low and tight with anger. "This barrel proves the fire was a lie, but he will just say we planted it. Crowley's word against ours." "Then we need more," Evelyn stated, her resolve hardening. "We need something he cannot deny, something on paper." "His office at the ranch," Rosa said, nodding. "He keeps meticulous records, ledgers, contracts. If there is a conspiracy, the proof will be there." Before they could plan further, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. A dozen riders were entering town. They were not the usual collection of dusty ranch hands or loud-mouthed bounty hunters. These men rode with a disciplined precision, their gear well maintained, their faces hard and emotionless. They moved like soldiers. At their head rode a man with a ramrod straight posture and cold, pale eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He wore the clean, tailored coat of a former cavalry officer, and he carried himself with an air of absolute authority. Kohana, who had been resting inside the clinic, appeared at Evelyn's side, his body tensing like a drawn bowstring. A look of recognition, and something akin to hatred, flickered in his eyes. "Pike," he breathed, the name a curse on his lips. "You know him?" Evelyn asked. "He was my captain," Kohana said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "When I scouted for the army, Captain Horace Pike." Pike reined in his horse in front of the sheriff's office and dismounted with fluid grace. He did not bother to knock, simply striding inside as if he owned the place, which, Evelyn suspected, he now did. Silas Crowley emerged from the saloon to greet him, a wide, predatory smile on his face. This was the next phase of his plan. The local thugs had failed. Now he had brought in the professionals. Later, while Evelyn tended to Kohana's shoulder, which had been badly strained by his efforts at the bridge, the tension between them was a palpable thing. The shared danger had forged a new intimacy, yet an ocean of unspoken things still lay between them. Around his neck, on a simple leather thong, rested a single, beautifully barred feather. It looked like the tail feather of a hawk or an eagle, but it was shaped and carved in a way that suggested it was more than just decoration. It was a thunderbird, a symbol of power and protection for his people. He caught her looking at it. "A promise," he said, his voice a low rumble, "to protect the pass, to keep the heart of the mountain from being torn out." She finished tying the bandage, her touch gentle. "You have a habit of keeping dangerous promises. It is the only kind worth making." She met his gaze, a hint of her earlier wit returning. "You owe me 4 stitches, from when you popped the last ones." A slow, unexpected smile touched the corners of his mouth, a rare sight that transformed his guarded features. "I will pay with 4 secrets." "That is a steep price," she teased, "but fair, though you might have to add a 5th secret. The one about that smile?" His smile faded, his expression turning serious again as the reality of their situation returned. "The first secret," he said quietly, "is that Pike does not just hunt me. He wants to own me. He has a paper, a warrant from years ago, for desertion. He said I led a patrol into an ambush. It was a lie. He sent us into a trap to see what the resistance was. He sacrificed his own men, but I was the only one who came back. He had me sign the report with my thumbprint, and he turned it into a confession." The legal noose. It was not just a bounty. It was a legitimate, government-sanctioned warrant that Pike could use to justify anything he did. The law, once again, was on the side of the lawless. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, the plan was set in motion. Rosa, in her deputy's uniform, rode out to the Crowley ranch with a fabricated report of rustlers spotted near the northern fence line. It was a flimsy pretext, but it was enough to draw most of the guards, including Pike, away from the main house. While they were gone, Evelyn, dressed in dark clothing, slipped through the shadows of the outbuildings, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Rosa had given her a hand-drawn map of the ground floor, marking the location of Crowley's study. The window was unlocked, just as Rosa had said it would be. Evelyn slid it open and slipped inside. Silent as a cat, the room smelled of leather, cigar smoke, and money. A large oak desk dominated the space, its surface neat and orderly. She lit a small match, shielding the flame with her hand, and began her search. The ledgers were filled with columns of figures, detailing cattle sales and supply costs. Nothing. She moved to a large, locked filing cabinet, using a metal probe from her medical kit. She worked at the simple lock. It clicked open. Inside were files of deeds, contracts, and correspondence. Her hands trembled as she sifted through them, the flickering match casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. And then she found it. It was a thick, legally bound document between Silas Crowley and the Great Western Rail Company. It was a mining contract. It granted Crowley's corporation exclusive rights to survey and excavate mineral deposits, specifically copper, in the region designated as Copper Pass. She scanned the dense legal text until one clause leaped out at her, chilling her to the bone. The contract, and all rights therein, were contingent upon the successful acquisition of the land from the federal government, a process that would be expedited once the area was, as the document stated, fully pacified and liberated from any remaining native inhabitants. Liberated. The word was a euphemism for extermination. This was her proof. This was the death warrant for Kohana's people. She tucked the contract into the bodice of her dress, her mind reeling. The papers of the law were a declaration of war, morality, justice, decency. They all stood on one side, while on the other stood a piece of paper that made it all legal. Suddenly, she heard the sound of approaching horses. They were back sooner than expected. Panic seized her. She extinguished the match, plunging the room into darkness, and scrambled back toward the window. But as she reached it, the door to the study swung open. A man holding a lantern stood silhouetted in the doorway. It was Sheriff Cole. "Looking for something, Doctor?" he asked, his voice dripping with false concern. Before she could answer, he lunged for her. She dodged, knocking over a chair, and bolted for the door. She ran blindly through the dark house, Cole's footsteps pounding behind her. She burst out the back door and into the night, gasping for air. The yard was suddenly flooded with light as Pike's men appeared with lanterns. She was surrounded. Cole grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "You are under arrest, Dr. Hart," he snarled, "for theft and trespass." But then another figure emerged from the shadows. It was Rosa, her pistol drawn and leveled squarely at the sheriff's chest. "Let her go, Matthew," she said, her voice deadly calm. Cole froze, his eyes wide with shock and betrayal. "Rosa, what is the meaning of this? Put that gun down." "The meaning is that I am done," she said. "I am done watching you serve him instead of the law." She motioned with her head toward a dark, narrow alley between the bunkhouse and the stables. "Go, now." Evelyn did not hesitate. She wrenched her arm from Cole's grasp and ran. Just as she reached the alley, Kohana materialized from the darkness, grabbing her hand and pulling her along. "This way," he urged. Shouts erupted behind them. The chase was on. They scrambled through the narrow passage and out into the open country behind the ranch, a chaotic landscape of rocks and scrub brush. The ground was uneven, treacherous in the dark. A gunshot cracked the night air, then another. They were shooting at them. They ran, hand in hand, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Pike was on their trail, his voice cutting through the darkness, directing his men with chilling efficiency. They were being herded, driven toward a rocky canyon wall. They scrambled up a steep embankment, loose rocks skittering under their feet. A bullet whined past Evelyn's ear, so close she felt its heat. Another struck the rock just beside Kohana's head, showering him with stone chips. He pushed her behind a large boulder, turning to face their pursuers, his own knife now in his hand, a desperate, futile gesture against the guns. Pike appeared on the ridge below them, raising his rifle, the moonlight glinting on the long barrel. He took careful aim. "It is over! Scout!" Pike called out, his voice calm and steady. Nowhere left to run. He fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Kohana grunted and staggered back, not from the impact of the bullet, but from the force of it striking something on his chest. He looked down. The bullet had hit the Thunderbird amulet, shattering the delicate, carved feather and severing the leather thong. The broken pieces fell to the dust at his feet. The amulet had saved his life. He looked up, his eyes locking with Evelyn's, in that single, shared glance. Everything was laid bare, the fear, the desperation, the startling, undeniable realization that their lives were now inextricably bound together. In this wilderness of greed and violence, they were all each other had. They needed each other to survive. The frantic, heart-pounding escape from Crowley's ranch gave way to a grueling, silent journey through the mountains. Kohana led Evelyn through a world of shadows and stone, his movement sure and silent in the darkness. He knew this land not as a map of lines and names, but as a living thing, its every contour and crevice committed to his memory. They climbed, their hands and feet finding purchase on paths that were invisible to Evelyn, until the sounds of pursuit faded and were replaced by the whisper of the wind through pine trees and the distant call of a night bird. Exhaustion was a heavy cloak on Evelyn's shoulders, but the cold, hard rectangle of the stolen contract pressed against her ribs was a constant reminder of why they could not stop. They arrived, not at a camp, but at a hidden sanctuary, tucked into a fold of the mountain. Sheltered by ancient junipers and towering rock formations, was a small settlement. It was not a war camp bristling with weapons and warriors. It was a place of refuge, a last holdout for the remnants of his people who had refused the reservations. A few wickiups, simple shelters of branches and hides, were clustered around a central fire pit. The air smelled of wood smoke and roasting piñon nuts. This was a community of survivors, old men with faces like carved mahogany, women working quietly with hides and baskets, and a handful of children whose brief, startled glances were filled with a wariness far beyond their years. Their arrival sent a ripple of alarm through the quiet camp. Faces turned toward them, and the silence was no longer peaceful, but charged with suspicion. Every eye was on Evelyn, the white woman, the intruder. She could feel their distrust like a physical barrier, a wall of shared pain and bitter experience. For a moment, she was not Dr. Evelyn Hart, a healer. She was merely the embodiment of the people who had taken their land, broken their treaties, and hunted them like animals. An old woman emerged from the largest wickiup, her back bent but her gaze as straight and sharp as an arrow. Her face was a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, each line telling a story Evelyn could not read. She walked with the aid of a smooth, carved stick, and the people parted for her with a reverence that was absolute. "Ma," Kohana said, his voice soft with respect. He spoke to her in the flowing, guttural sounds of the Apache language, his words a mixture of explanation and reassurance. The old woman, his grandmother, listened without expression, her dark, knowing eyes fixed on Evelyn. She did not look at Evelyn with the open hostility of the others, but with a deep, penetrating scrutiny that seemed to peel back the layers of her skin and look directly into her soul. Another figure detached himself from the shadows near the fire. He was a young man, perhaps Kohana's age, with a powerful build and a restless energy that seemed to radiate from him. His face was set in a permanent scowl, and his eyes burned with a fierce, impatient fire. "You bring one of them here," Kohana the man challenged, his voice sharp with contempt. He spoke in English. "For Evelyn's benefit, after everything they have done, have you forgotten the soldiers? The broken promises?" "This is Chayton," Kohana said to Evelyn, his voice low. "We were boys together." Then he turned back to his friend. "She is not one of them. Chayton, she saved my life, and she fights Crowley, same as us." "She fights with papers and words." Chayton scoffed. "We need to fight with knives and fire. Crowley burns our barns. We should burn his house. It is the only language they understand." The debate was interrupted by a woman's cry, a sound of pure anguish from one of the shelters. A young mother burst out, her face streaked with tears, a small bundle clutched in her arms. She ran to Ma, speaking in a desperate, pleading torrent of Apache. Evelyn stepped forward, her medical instincts taking over. "What is it? What is wrong?" Kohana translated, his expression grim. "Her daughter. The girl cannot breathe. The fever has been on her for 2 days." Evelyn could hear the child's breathing from across the fire, a shallow, rasping sound that tore at her heart. Pneumonia. Without proper care, the girl would not last the night. She looked at the desperate mother, then at the suspicious faces around her. "I can help," she said, her voice clear and firm. "I am a doctor." Chayton laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "A white doctor. She will probably give the child poison." But Ma silenced him with a glance. She looked at Evelyn, her ancient eyes weighing the risk against the child's life. She saw the genuine concern in Evelyn's face, the professional confidence in her posture. She spoke a few quiet words in Apache. "My grandmother says to try," Kohana said. The mother, hesitant but desperate, led Evelyn into the wickiup, inside, by the light of a small, smoky fire. The little girl lay on a pile of soft furs, her small chest heaving with the effort of each breath. Evelyn knelt, her movements calm and reassuring. She took out her stethoscope, a strange, metallic object that made the mother flinch. "It is all right," Evelyn said softly, placing the earpieces in her own ears and the cold metal disc on the child's back. "It just helps me to listen." She listened to the congestion in the child's lungs. It was bad. She worked quickly, opening her medical bag. She had digitalis to strengthen the heart and a small amount of quinine for the fever. But she needed something to ease the breathing. She looked at Ma, who had followed her into the shelter. "Is there a plant, an herb you use for coughs, for clearing the lungs?" The old woman nodded. She disappeared for a moment and returned with a handful of dried leaves. Osha root, a powerful, respected medicine of the mountains, following the old woman's instructions. Evelyn helped prepare a tea, steeping the root and adding a tiny bit of honey from her own supplies to make it palatable. She gently lifted the child's head and coaxed the warm liquid between her lips. It was a bridge between two worlds, the knowledge of an Eastern medical school and the ancient wisdom of the mountains, combined in a desperate effort to save one small life. For hours she stayed with the child, bathing her face with cool water, listening to her breathing, and offering sips of the tea. Outside, Kohana watched the entrance to the shelter, his heart a battlefield of conflicting emotions. He saw in Evelyn's actions a different kind of strength, not the strength of a warrior, but the quiet, relentless strength of a healer. It was the way of rebuilding, not just of resisting. It was a strength that stood in stark contrast to the angry, destructive path offered by Chaitin. He was a man caught between the blade and the written word, between the warrior's path he had been raised on and this new, uncertain trail that Evelyn was blazing before him. Finally, long after midnight, Evelyn emerged from the wickiup. The child's breathing was easier. The fever had dropped slightly. She was sleeping peacefully. A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the camp. The wall of suspicion had not crumbled, but a door had been opened. The elders convened around the main fire. It was time for a council. Chaitin was the first to speak, his voice ringing with passion and fury. He argued for war, a raid on Crowley's ranch, an ambush of Pike's men. "We must show them we are not afraid to die," he declared. "We must make them pay in blood for what they have taken." Some of the younger men grunted in agreement, their faces grim in the firelight. Then Evelyn, invited into the circle by a nod from Maya, stepped forward. She pulled the mining contract from her dress. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that silenced the entire council. "This is what they want," she said, holding up the document. "It is not just about the land. It is about what is underneath it. Copper." She explained the cold, legal terms, translating them into the reality of their situation. They plan to use black powder, explosives. They will blow the top from the mountain. They will destroy Copper Pass. And the contract says they will do it as soon as the area is, quote, liberated. She paused, letting the ugly word hang in the air. This paper is their justification. A fight is what they want. It will prove to the government that you are hostiles, and it will give them the excuse they need to bring in the army and wipe you out. She looked at Kohana. "But there is another way." She spoke of the ledgers, of the proof of Crowley's crimes. "There is another book, a record of the money he has paid, the bribes he has made. If we get that book, we can use their own laws against them. We do not have to fight his army of thugs. We can make the law fight him." It was a new kind of warfare, a silent, patient battle fought with paper and ink instead of bullets and arrows. For a long moment, there was silence as the elders considered this. It was Ma who spoke first. "The coyote is strong," she said, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "But the tortoise lives longer. He wins by knowing when to pull his head into his shell." Kohana stood. He had made his choice. "Chaitin is my brother," he said, his eyes on his friend. "His heart is true, but his path leads to graves. Evelyn's path leads to a chance, a small one, but a chance for our children to live. We will not be murderers. We will be accusers. We will steal his book of lies and show it to the world." The council agreed. The decision was made later, as the fire died down to glowing embers. Ma approached Evelyn. She held a thin, soft strip of tanned deerskin. Burned into the leather was a simple, powerful symbol of a zigzagging line, the mark of lightning. "For the one who guards the path," Ma said, her English slow and careful. She tied the leather band around Evelyn's wrist. It was not a decoration. It was an acceptance, a mark of trust. Evelyn looked down at the symbol, a lump forming in her throat. She had been an outsider, an enemy. Now, she was a guardian. She accepted the honor with a humble nod, unable to speak. But one person could not accept the council's decision. Chayton stood abruptly, his face a mask of bitter disappointment and rage. "This is the talk of cowards," he spat, his glare fixed on Kohana. "While you play with paper, they will bring their dynamite. You are a fool to trust her. You are a fool to trust their laws." "Chayton, do not do this," Kohana pleaded. "I will do what a warrior does," Chayton snarled. "I will find my own allies, men who are not afraid to fight." He turned his back on the council, on his friend, on the dying embers of the fire, and stalked out of the camp, disappearing into the impenetrable darkness of the mountains. A seed of tragedy had been sown, and in the cold, silent night, Evelyn could already feel the bitter chill of its coming harvest. The wind that swept down from the high mesas was cold, carrying the clean, sharp scent of pine and the promise of more rain. In the hidden sanctuary of the Apache, the council's decision had settled into a quiet, tense resolve. Chayton's angry departure had left a void, a wound in the camp's fragile unity. They had to act, and they had to act quickly, before his bitterness could curdle into betrayal. A secret meeting was arranged through a trusted Mexican goatherd who owed his son's life to Evelyn's care. Rosa Valdez met Evelyn at dawn in a secluded canyon miles from town. "Cole is jumpy as a cat on a hot griddle," Rosa reported, her breath misting in the cool air. "Crowley and Pike are in charge now. They have put armed guards on everything, including the telegraph office. They are waiting for you and Kohana to make a mistake." The plan they forged was desperate, a three-pronged assault on Crowley's fortress of lies. Rosa would be the diversion. She would report a cattle stampede, a fire, anything to draw Sheriff Cole and as many of Pike's men as possible away from the town and the ranch. Evelyn, whose face was now as wanted as Kohana's, had the most dangerous job in town. She would cut the telegraph wire. It was their only way to ensure Pike could not summon military reinforcements from the nearest fort. That left Kohana. He would go for the prize. The black ledger Evelyn was certain Crowley kept. The book that held the names of every bribed official and the true details of his criminal enterprise. That night, a thin drizzle began to fall, slicking the rocks and muffling all sound. It was a ghost's moon, a sliver of silver that offered little light. The operation began. Rosa rode hard into Dry Creek, her face a mask of panic, shouting about a fire in an outlying canyon. A story convincing enough to send Cole and a half-dozen of Pike's mercenaries pounding into the darkness. At the same time, Evelyn moved through the back alleys of the town she'd once called home. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every creak of a floorboard sounded like a gunshot. The telegraph office was a small, lonely building at the end of the main street. A single guard sat on the porch, his chair tilted back, a rifle across his lap. Evelyn circled around to the back, the wires, thin black lines against the bruised purple of the sky, ran from a ceramic insulator on the wall and up a tall pole. She pulled a pair of heavy wire cutters from her satchel. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the enormity of the act. This was not just cutting a wire. It was severing Dry Creek's connection to the outside world. It was an act of rebellion. With a sharp snap, the line went dead. Miles away, Kohana moved through the darkness toward the Crowley ranch. He did not approach from the road but came from the high ground, moving with the patient silence of a mountain lion. He watched as the main house remained lit, but the activity was focused there, the remaining guards drawn to the comfort of a roof and a deck of cards. The stables were dark, forgotten. This was his target. He had remembered a detail from his brief time in Crowley's study, a faint draft coming from beneath a bookshelf, a detail that suggested a space below. But he had been wrong about the location. The true secret was not in the house. He slipped into the cavernous stable, the air thick with the smell of hay and horse. He moved past the stalls, his moccasins making no sound on the dirt floor. In the far corner, under a pile of empty grain sacks, he found it a heavy wooden trap-door with an iron ring. He lifted it. A wave of cool, musty air rose to meet him. He descended into the darkness, a small tallow candle providing a flickering, uncertain light. The cellar was not a root cellar. It was an office, a secret sanctuary for Crowley's true business. A small, sturdy desk stood against one wall, and shelves lined with ledgers and file boxes rose to the low ceiling. This was the heart of the beast. He began his search, his eyes scanning the neatly labeled spines. His fingers brushed against one particular volume, a thick, black, leather-bound ledger with no label at all. He opened it. The book was filled with Crowley's precise, angular handwriting. It was a meticulous record of corruption, names of territorial judges next to figures that could buy a man 1,000 acres, payments to land assessors for fraudulent surveys, and a separate section detailing cash disbursements to Captain Horace Pike and his company of mercenaries. Next to one entry, dated the week of the Miller barn fire, was a notation bonus HP for services rendered, new spurs. Kohana's breath caught in his throat. He rummaged through a refuse box in the corner and found it. Tossed away with other trash, a single, custom-made steel spur, its star-shaped rowel identical to the broken piece Evelyn had found in the ashes. The matching piece, the final, undeniable proof. He took the ledger and the spur and turned to leave. His mission was complete. As he climbed out of the cellar and made his way out of the stables, he felt a presence. He flattened himself into the shadows as a figure moved across the rain-slicked yard. It was Chayton. His friend was supposed to be miles away, nursing his anger. What was he doing here? Kohana slipped away, melting back into the landscape, the heavy ledger tucked inside his shirt. He followed the creek bed, the fastest route to the rendezvous point, an old wooden bridge a mile from the ranch. The drizzle was getting heavier now, the footing treacherous. He was halfway across the bridge, its wet planks slick beneath his feet, when a figure stepped out of the gloom at the other end, blocking his path. It was Chayton. "I knew you would succeed." "Kohana," Chayton said, his voice flat. "You were always the best scout, the best thief." "Chayton, what is this? I am not your enemy." "No," Chayton agreed, taking a step forward. "Crowley is our enemy, but your way is the way of a fool. You think his law will save us. His law is a rope designed to hang us. I will not die waiting for a white man's justice." "What do you want, Chayton?" "The book," he said, his eyes hard. "Give me the ledger. I will not trade it for justice. I will trade it for land, a piece of this territory for our people, a place where we can live without his interference. He will give it to us, in exchange for his secrets. It is the only bargain he will understand." The idealism in his friend's heart had fractured, broken into 1,000 pieces of desperate pragmatism. He had come not to kill, but to steal the only hope they had. "I cannot do that," Kohana said quietly. "Then I will take it." Chayton lunged. The fight was a desperate, brutal affair on the narrow, rain-slicked bridge. It was not a warrior's dance, but a clumsy, heartbreaking struggle between two men who had once been brothers. They slipped and slid on the wet wood, their hands grappling, their breath coming in ragged bursts. Chayton was stronger, his rage giving him power, but Kohana was quicker, his movements honed by years of survival. They crashed against the railing, the old wood groaning in protest. Below them, the creek churned, swollen by the rain. Kohana saw an opening. He could have drawn his knife, he could have ended it, but as he looked into Chayton's eyes, he saw not an enemy, but the ghost of his friend. A man so consumed by a legacy of pain that he was willing to sacrifice his honor for a sliver of hope. Kohana would not kill him. Instead, he twisted, using Chaitan's momentum against him. He grabbed Chaitan's foot, and with a sharp, wrenching motion, he broke the man's remaining spur from his boot heel. He did not throw a punch. He did not draw his blade. He simply opened his hand and let the piece of steel, the symbol of the mercenary's violence, fall into the dark water below. The act was a final, symbolic rejection of Chaitan's path. Chaitan stared at him, his face a mixture of shock and confusion. The fight had gone out of him. In that moment of hesitation, Evelyn appeared at the far end of the bridge, her face pale in the gloom. The reunion was cut short by the sound of hoofbeats. A dozen or more, closing in from both sides. They were trapped. Pike, Crowley, and their men emerged from the trees, their lanterns turning the rainy night into a hellish stage. "An impressive performance," Pike said, his voice cutting through the rain. He held up the old warrant. "Kohana, you are under arrest for desertion, and you, Dr. Hart, as his accomplice in rebellion against the authority of the United States Army. That is a hanging offense." Crowley stepped forward, a smug, triumphant look on his face. "But it does not have to be," he said, his eyes fixed on Evelyn. He gestured to the ledger Kohana was clutching. "Give me the book, give me your silence, and you can both ride out of this territory, free and clear. No one has to get hurt. A simple choice. Doctor, it was the ultimate temptation, a chance to walk away, to survive." Evelyn looked at Kohana, then back at Crowley's smiling face. She thought of the little girl she had treated, of the old woman at the well, of the broken promise represented by the Thunderbird amulet. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong. Crowley's smile vanished. "Wrong answer." Pike raised his rifle, but just as he did, Evelyn's eyes rolled back in her head. She gave a small, pitiful gasp and her knees buckled. She collapsed to the ground in a heap, feigning a dead faint. For a split second, every man's attention was on her. It was the only opening they would get. In the confusion, her hand, hidden by her skirts, reached for the small storm lantern at her feet. It was a model designed to burn even in the rain. Its reservoir filled not with oil, but with highly flammable spirits of alcohol she used for cleaning instruments. With a flick of her thumb, she opened the reservoir cap and threw the lantern against the wooden railing. The glass shattered. The alcohol ignited with a loud whoosh, a plume of blue and orange flame erupting in the night. The horses shrieked and reared in terror. Men shouted in alarm. The diversion was perfect. Kohana grabbed Evelyn's arm, pulling her to her feet, and they plunged off the side of the bridge, not into the main current, but into the thick brush that lined the steep bank. They scrambled into the darkness as the fire spread, consuming the dry railing of the bridge, a wall of flame separating them from their enemies. They ran, fueled by adrenaline and desperation, until the shouting and the light of the fire were far behind them. They finally found shelter in a small, dilapidated cabin, a long-abandoned prospector's shack nestled in a valley thick with mesquite. They collapsed onto the dirt floor, gasping for air, the precious ledger safe between them. Outside, the drizzle turned into a driving rain, and a low, angry rumble of thunder echoed through the valley. A new storm was breaking, and they were in its eye. The cabin was a tiny, forgotten box in a vast, weeping wilderness. Rain hammered a frantic, ceaseless rhythm on the rusted tin roof, a sound so loud it seemed to fill the space between them, leaving no room for words. Inside, it was dark and smelled of damp earth, old rot, and the sharp, clean scent of the storm. They were fugitives. Their world shrunk to the four crumbling walls of the prospector's shack. Between them on the dirt floor, a testament to their crime and their only hope, lay Crowley's black ledger, its leather cover slick with rainwater. Kohana worked with a quiet, focused intensity, his movements economical and precise. He coaxed a small, hesitant flame from a handful of dry tinder he had carried in an oilskin pouch, feeding it splinters of wood from a broken crate until it grew into a cheerful, crackling fire. The light pushed back the oppressive darkness, casting their shadows, long and distorted, against the rough timber walls. Evelyn huddled near the nascent warmth, a coarse wool blanket draped over her shoulders. She was shaking, a deep, bone-grinding tremor that she could not control. It had started after the adrenaline of their escape had worn off, a reaction to the cold plunge into the brush and the hours spent running in the soaking rain. Her teeth chattered, and a dull ache was beginning to spread behind her eyes. It was more than just a chill. It was the insidious onset of a fever. Kohana saw it. He saw the unnatural brightness of her eyes in the firelight and the pale, bluish tint of her lips. He left the fireside and disappeared back into the storm. He returned a few minutes later, his dark hair plastered to his head, carrying a handful of dripping green leaves and a piece of gnarled root he had dug from the earth near the cabin. He found a dented tin cup, rinsed it with rainwater, and began preparing a brew over the fire, crushing the sage leaves between his fingers to release their pungent, medicinal scent, and adding shavings of the yucca root to the water. He brought the steaming cup to her, his large, calloused hand steady. "Drink," he commanded gently. "It will warm you. The sage will help the fever." She took the cup, her hands trembling so much she nearly spilled the hot liquid. He knelt in front of her and cupped his hands around hers, steadying them. His touch was warm and solid, a silent anchor in the storm of her shivering. She drank the tea. It was bitter and earthy, but a profound warmth spread from her chest outward, a slow, creeping tide against the cold. "You are a man of many talents, it seems," she said, her voice a little shaky. "Scout, warrior, doctor of the forest." He watched her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "My grandmother taught me the plants. She says the earth provides the cure for every illness, if you know where to look." Evelyn managed a small smile, a glimmer of her former wit returning. "Well, your methods are certainly more direct, I will say. The stitches you put in your own arm with that sinew and bone needle were straighter than some I have seen from surgeons back east with their fine steel." A corner of his mouth twitched, the ghost of his rare smile. "Perhaps your eastern surgeons should spend less time in their fancy schools and more time learning from porcupines." The easy banter felt strange and yet perfectly natural. A small island of normalcy in a sea of chaos. It was a language of its own, a way of speaking of the trust that was growing between them without having to use the dangerous, unfamiliar words of affection. The rain on the roof softened its frantic drumming, settling into a steady, almost soothing patter. The fire crackled, and the cabin was filled with a warm, companionable silence. But the shivering did not stop entirely. A deep, persistent chill remained lodged in her bones. Kohana noticed the damp shawl still clinging to her shoulders, dark with rainwater. He reached out, his movements slow and deliberate, and his fingers brushed the nape of her neck as he untucked the wet wool. His touch was electric, a jolt of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She flinched, not from fear, but from the sudden, overwhelming intimacy of the small gesture. "Stop teasing," she pleaded, the words a whispered breath, barely audible above the rain. It was not a protest, but an admission. An admission that his closeness was affecting her, that the careful walls she had built around her heart were beginning to crumble. The Apache smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his dark eyes, filling them with a light she had never seen before. "As you wish," he murmured, his voice a low, gentle rumble. His hands played wicked games, but the wickedness was not what she might have imagined. It was a wickedness of profound and unexpected tenderness. He took the damp shawl and tossed it aside. Then he took the bundle of sage leaves he had set by the fire to warm and dry. He cupped them in his hands, and with a touch as soft as a moth's wing, he began to press the warm, fragrant bundle against her skin. He traced a slow path along her chilled arms, the gentle heat and the sharp, clean scent of the herbs seeping into her, chasing away the last of the cold. His hands moved to her shoulders, then to the tense muscles of her neck, the warmth, a comforting, hypnotic presence. She closed her eyes, her head tilting back in a gesture of pure, unconscious trust. He was so close now she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. When he took the herbs away, she felt a sense of loss, but it was replaced by something else. He leaned in, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion or of desperate, frantic need. It was a kiss of deep, soul-shaking tenderness. It was slow and long and infinitely gentle, a question and an answer all in one. It spoke of shared danger and mutual respect. It was a promise, made in the heart of a storm, in a forgotten cabin, between two people who should have been enemies but had become each other's only sanctuary. When they finally broke apart, the air in the small cabin was thick with unspoken emotion. They simply looked at each other, the firelight dancing in their eyes. It was Kohana who spoke first, his voice rough with a vulnerability she had never heard from him before. When Pike fired his rifle, he said, his gaze locked on hers, "I did not fear the bullet. I feared where it would go if it missed me." He confessed his deepest fear, not of death, but of losing her. "I have spent my life learning not to be afraid of pain, or of dying. But I was afraid in that moment, more afraid than I have ever been." A lump formed in Evelyn's throat. She reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "I know," she whispered, because she had felt it too. A terror so absolute it had stolen the air from her lungs. She thought of the life she had left behind, a life of order and books and carefully constructed principles. It seemed like a dream from another lifetime. "I spent years learning about justice from books," she confessed, her voice filled with a quiet revelation. "I believed in a justice written in black ink, on crisp white paper, signed and sealed by men in clean suits. But that paper, the contract I stole, it is a lie. It is a tool for murder, wrapped in the language of the law. I am tired of a justice that can be bought and sold. I want the kind of justice that is written in here." She pressed her hand to her heart, the kind that is built by what we do, by our actions. His hand covered hers, his fingers lacing through her own. "Then what do we do now?" The kiss, the confessions, it had all led to this. The emotional turning point had become a strategic one. They were no longer just running. They were choosing their next move. "We do not run," Evelyn said, a new strength in her voice. "We go back. We take this book to Dry Creek. We walk into the middle of the town, and we show it to everyone. We make the people our jury. Reverend Avery, the Millers, even Rosa. We force them all to be witnesses. Crowley can buy the sheriff, and he can buy a judge. But he cannot buy the entire town, not if they are forced to see the truth with their own eyes." It was a mad, desperate gamble. They would be walking into the lion's den, but as he looked at the fierce resolve in her eyes, Kohana knew it was the only way. "And if we fail," he asked, his voice practical, though he already knew the answer. "If they do not listen." "If we fail," she said, her expression softening with a fierce, protective love. "Then you get the children out. You take them and Ma and the others, and you disappear so far into these mountains that Pike can never find you. That is our promise." As if in response to their decision, the storm outside began to break. The hammering rain gentled to a soft, whispering drizzle. Through a crack in the cabin wall, the clouds began to part, revealing a sliver of a moon. A moment later, the tentative, hopeful song of a night bird trilled through the quiet air, a sound that promised a new day was coming. Kohana stood and went to the small, grimy window, peering out into the darkness. He was silent for a long moment. "Look," he said. Evelyn joined him. Far in the distance, a tiny pinprick of light appeared on a ridge overlooking Dry Creek. It was a lantern. As they watched, it swung in a slow, deliberate arc. Once, twice, 3 times. It was a signal. Rosa's signal. The town was beginning to doubt. The town was beginning to stir. They were not alone. Hope, a small, fragile, but fiercely burning ember, ignited in the darkness. Tomorrow, they would not be running from the storm. They would be riding into it, together. The sun rose high over Dry Creek, baking the red dust of the main street until the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat. There was no court of law in the territory for 100 miles. But on this day, justice, or some raw, frontier version of it, was holding session. The porch of the sheriff's office had become the bench, and the entire town, a tense, sweating jury. They had been drawn by whispers that had spread like wildfire in the night. Whispers carried by Rosa Valdez and confirmed by the solemn tolling of Reverend Avery's church bell an hour after dawn, a sound usually reserved for funerals or fire. Silas Crowley stood on the porch, flanked by a slick, well-dressed lawyer he had sent for from a larger town. He looked confident, almost bored, a man of power observing a minor peasant uprising. Across the street, on the flat roof of the general store, the sun glinted off the long barrel of a rifle. Captain Horace Pike was in position, a silent, deadly arbiter overlooking the proceedings. Then they came. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as Evelyn Hart and Kohana walked into the center of the square. They looked worn and weary, their clothes stained with mud and travel, but they walked with their heads held high. In Evelyn's arms, wrapped in an oilskin cloth, was the black ledger. Rosa stood near the steps of the porch, her hand resting on the butt of her pistol, her face unreadable. She was no longer standing beside Sheriff Cole. She was standing opposite him. Evelyn did not wait for an invitation. She walked to the center of the gathering, placed the tar barrel from the Miller fire on the ground, and unwrapped the ledger. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was as clear and steady as a teacher addressing her classroom. "I am not here to break the law," she began, her eyes sweeping over the faces of her neighbors. "I am here to uphold it. For months, you have been told that the Apache are your enemy. You have been told that they burn your property and threaten your lives. You have been told this by the man who profits from your fear." She gestured to the tar barrel. "This was found at the collapsed bridge. It bears the mark of the Sea Ranch. It is filled with coal tar, an accelerant, the kind a man would use if he wanted to make sure a fire burned hot and fast." A murmur went through the crowd. Henry Miller, the owner of the burned barn, stared at the barrel, his face a knot of confusion and dawning anger. "But this," Evelyn continued, holding up the black ledger, "is the real evidence." She opened the book. "This is Silas Crowley's private account book. It details payments made, not for cattle or for feed, but for fear." She began to read, her voice ringing out in the still, hot air. "To Judge Alistair Finch, $500, for favorable land assessments. To Territorial Surveyor Marcus Thorne, $300, for altered survey lines." She read name after name, a litany of corruption that reached far beyond their small town. Then she found the final entries. To Captain Horace Pike, a bonus, for services rendered in the matter of the Miller barn, paid for, among other things, a new set of spurs. She reached into her pocket and held up the broken spur she had found in the ashes. "And here," she said, her voice dropping, "is the other bonus, paid to his accomplice on that same night." She held up the intact, matching spur taken from the secret cellar. The star-shaped rowels were identical. Rosa Valdez stepped forward. "I can also attest," she said, her voice firm and official, "that on the night of every reported raid, a telegraph message was sent from the Sea Ranch office, and the lines were then mysteriously cut for several hours afterward. He was reporting his own crimes before they even happened." The murmur in the crowd grew louder, angrier. Sheriff Cole, his face purple with rage and panic, saw his authority crumbling. "This is an outrage," he bellowed, acting on a sharp nod from Crowley. "This evidence was obtained illegally. It is inadmissible. I am confiscating this book." He lunged down the steps, his hand outstretched to grab the ledger from Evelyn. But before his fingers could touch it, Kohana moved. He stepped out from Evelyn's side, into the open, sun-baked square. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace. He did not draw a weapon. Instead, he slowly, methodically, unbuckled the knife belt from his waist and let it fall to the dust. He raised his empty hands, palms forward, a universal gesture of peace. The crowd fell silent, their attention fixed on him. "I will not talk to you of ledgers and laws," he said, his voice quiet yet carrying to every corner of the square. "I will tell you a story. 2 weeks ago, a small girl from my people, her name was Little Dove, died. She did not die from a bullet. She did not die from a sickness you could see. She died of a thirst her mother could not quench. They had walked for 2 days to reach this town, to trade for medicine. They came to your well, the one that is supposed to be for everyone. But she was turned away. She was a child, and she was told the water was not for her kind." He paused, his dark eyes moving from one face to another, forcing them to see, to feel the weight of his words. "This land does not have enough water for one small girl to drink, but it has enough for Mr. Crowley's thousands of cattle. He wants to own the water, he wants to own the grass, he wants to own the mountain. And to do that, he must make you believe that a thirsty child is your enemy. He will not stop until he has all of it. And we are all gone. Today it is our children. Tomorrow, it will be yours." His words hung in the air, a simple, profound accusation that cut deeper than any legal document. In that moment, a single shot cracked the silence, but it did not come from Pike's rifle. It came from a side street. Chayton stumbled into the open, a smoking pistol in his hand. He had shot one of Pike's men who had been positioned on a smaller building. "Crowley!" Chayton roared, his face a mask of fury and betrayal. "You liar! You promised our people a place. You promised land for that book." On the roof, Pike reacted instantly, swiveling his high-powered rifle. The showdown was brutally short. Chayton, seeing that he was exposed and outgunned, saw something else too. A young Mexican mother and her son, caught in the open, were directly in Pike's line of sight. With a final, desperate cry, Chayton threw himself in front of them, shoving them toward the cover of a horse trough. Pike's rifle boomed, and Chayton was thrown backward, a red flower blooming on his chest. He had paid his debt of honor. In the ensuing chaos, Pike turned his sights on the man he considered the real threat. He fired at Kohana. The bullet struck Kohana square in the chest with a heavy, sickening thud. He staggered back, a look of shock on his face. But he did not fall. The bullet had struck the spot where his Thunderbird amulet had once hung. And though the charm was gone, he stood firm, a living testament that the strength of a promise is carried in the heart of the person who makes it, not in the object they wear. The town, which had been a passive audience, erupted. Rosa Valdez seized the moment of chaos. She drew her pistol, strode up to the stunned Sheriff Cole, and pressed the barrel to his temple. "Matthew Cole," she declared for all to hear, "you are under arrest." She ripped the tin star from his vest and disarmed him in one fluid motion. At that exact moment, another sound pierced the air, a sound of pure, righteous anger. The church bell began to ring, a frantic, insistent peal. Reverend Avery was pulling the rope, his face set with a grim determination, calling his flock not to prayer, but to action. The sound was a judgment. Seeing the battle was lost, Crowley panicked. He shoved his lawyer aside and bolted, running for his horse tethered near the edge of town. But the people of Dry Creek, the men and women he had manipulated and lied to, were no longer afraid. They moved, forming a human wall, blocking his escape. He was forced to turn, running toward the only path left open, the muddy, treacherous ground near the collapsed bridge. Evelyn was there, standing on the far side of the washout, blocking his path. Rosa closed in from behind. On the roof, A wounded but determined townsman fired his hunting rifle, and Pike, the cold-blooded professional, tumbled from his perch. Crowley was trapped. He made one last, desperate lunge for freedom, but his fine leather boots found no purchase in the slick, red mud. He slipped, his arms windmilling, and tumbled down the steep embankment, landing with a splash in the very sludge his greed had helped create. Rosa was there a moment later, her pistol steady, the cold metal of the handcuffs clicking shut around his wrists. The square grew quiet. The Battle of Dry Creek was over. Reverend Avery appeared, holding a fresh sheet of paper and a pen, in a clear, unwavering hand. He began to write. He wrote down what they had all seen, what they had all heard, and then, one by one, the people of the town came forward to sign their names to the document. Henry Miller, the Schmidt family, who had been saved at the bridge, the Mexican Mother Chayton had died to protect. It was a collective roar, a community's verdict. They sent a rider to the territorial capital with their testimony and a formal petition. Until the state could rule, they declared, Copper Pass and its waters were under the protection of the community, to be shared by all. Justice, for a day, was no longer silent. The days that followed the public trial were quiet, as if the town itself were holding its breath, recovering from a long fever. The high drama of the confrontation gave way to the slow, steady work of mending. The change was not loud or sudden, but it was as real and tangible as the newly rebuilt bridge over Copper Pass. It began with a simple, profound act. Reverend Avery, his face grim with the weight of years of silent complicity, walked to the public well, and with a claw hammer, he pried the crude, painted sign from the crossbeam. The wood splintered as he pulled the nails free. The sign, which read, "No Indians," fell face down in the red dust. He did not say a word, but every person who saw him understood. The poison was being drawn out. Soon after, the first Apache children, shy and wide-eyed, appeared at the door of Evelyn's schoolhouse. They were brought by their mothers, who stood at a respectful distance, their expressions a mixture of hope and deep-seated caution. Evelyn welcomed them with a smile that asked for nothing but trust, seating them among the white and Mexican children who stared with open, unabashed curiosity. The clinic, too, became a place of quiet integration. An old Apache man with a festering wound on his hand was brought in, and Evelyn treated him with the same gentle efficiency she gave to everyone, the shared space of healing becoming a silent treaty between their peoples. The funeral for Chayton was a spare, windswept affair on a low mesa overlooking the valley. There were no grand speeches, no sermon from the Reverend. There was only the wind, the vast, silent sky, and the small group that had gathered to mark his passing. Kohana stood over the simple grave, a mound of stones that would protect his friend from the coyotes. In his hand, he held the single, unbroken spur he had taken from Chayton's boot on the bridge. It was a symbol of the violent path his friend had chosen, the path of the mercenary, the path of trading honor for a false promise of power. He looked at it for a long moment, his face a mask of sorrow and understanding. Then he bent down and gently placed the spur on top of the stones. It was an act of forgiveness, a final, quiet letting go of the anger and betrayal, leaving only the memory of the boy he had once known. Evelyn and Rosa stood a short distance away, silent witnesses to his grief. Rosa Valdez now wore the tin star she had ripped from Matthew Cole's vest. The town council, led by a newly resolute Henry Miller, had appointed her acting sheriff until the territorial marshals could sort things out. She took to the job as if born for it, her quiet authority a welcome change from Cole's blustering incompetence. Armed with Crowley's ledger, she began the slow, methodical work of unraveling his web of corruption. Letters were dispatched, and soon, official-looking men in dusty suits began to arrive in Dry Creek, asking questions and serving papers that made important men in faraway towns begin to sweat. Captain Horace Pike did not die. He survived, a testament to his own tough, wiry constitution. But a townsman's bullet had shattered his hip, and another had torn through his shooting arm, leaving it useless. Evelyn had treated him as her oath demanded, cleaning his wounds and setting the bones as best she could. He had watched her with his cold, pale eyes, his silence filled with a bitter, seething hatred. A week later, 2 federal marshals loaded him onto a prison wagon. He was crippled, his career as a soldier of fortune over, as they chained his wrists. He looked over at Kohana, who was watching from a distance. "You think you have won," Scout Pike sneered, his voice a low rasp of pain and fury. "You won nothing. You just delayed the inevitable. There will always be another Crowley, another railroad, another man with a contract. The world belongs to the men who are willing to take it." He spat on the ground. "The winner is not always the man with the faster gun. I will grant you that. Sometimes it is the man with the better lie. And you people, you are the worst liars of all. You lie to yourselves, thinking you can live in a world that has no room for you." He was still muttering his venomous prophecies as the wagon rattled away, leaving a cloud of red dust in its wake. In the quiet evenings, Kohana found himself wrestling with a question that had no easy answer. His purpose, for so long, had been to fight, to protect, to resist. Now, the battle was over, at least for a time. He was a man of the mountains, of wide open spaces and silent trails. The thought of staying in Dry Creek, with its fences and its rules, felt like a cage, no matter how gilded. He walked with his grandmother, Ma, along the creek bed, the sound of the water a soothing companion. "The town is changing," he said, more to himself than to her, "but it is still their town. Perhaps I should take our people. Go north, find a place they have not yet ruined." Maya stopped and looked at the mountain that loomed over them, its peaks still touched by the last rays of the sun. "You speak of this land as if it is a horse to be ridden or a blanket to be owned," she said, her voice as soft as the evening breeze. "The land is not ours. We are the land's. It does not need us to own it. It only needs us not to betray it. You did not betray it. My son, you kept your promise." She placed a frail, wrinkled hand on his arm. "A home is not the place you are from. It is the place you are needed." Her words settled in his heart, a seed of truth taking root. The next afternoon, Evelyn found him sitting by the newly repaired town well, watching the children play. She sat beside him. "The school is getting crowded," she said, a playful smile on her lips. "And my teaching methods are, I am afraid, rather boring. All books and chalk dust. The children, all of them, could learn much from you." She turned to him, her expression sincere. "I was wondering if you would consider being a guest teacher, to teach them in the Apache way, through stories." He looked at her, surprised. "I am not a teacher." "No," she agreed. "You are a storyteller. It is a much higher calling." And so he began. He did not stand at the front of the classroom. He took the children outside, under the shade of a large cottonwood tree. He did not use a book. He used the world around them. He taught them how to tie a knot that would never slip and one that could be released with a single tug. He showed them how to read the clouds, to know when the rain was coming, not as a threat, but as a gift. He told them the story of the trickster coyote, and in doing so, taught them about cleverness and folly. The children were mesmerized. They called him, with the simple, unvarnished wisdom of the young, the cactus doctor, because he, like the desert plant, was tough and prickly on the outside but held a surprising amount of life within. One evening, as the sun was setting, Evelyn stood on a small ladder, putting the finishing touches on the new well house. For days, in her spare time, she had been carving a small piece of cottonwood root. Now, she carefully placed the finished object on the center of the main crossbeam. It was a small, charmingly rustic figure of a rooster, its head thrown back as if crowing at the dawn. It was a guardian, a promise of a new day for everyone. Kohana came and stood beside her, looking up at her handiwork. "It is a fine bird," he said, a note of amusement in his voice. "It is to remind us that the sun will rise again," she said, climbing down from the ladder. She turned to face him, wiping a smudge of dust from her cheek. The setting sun cast a golden light around them, and in its warm glow, all the hardship and fear seemed to melt away, leaving only the simple, profound fact of their togetherness. "Well, Cactus Doctor," she said, her eyes twinkling, "I believe all our debts are settled." "Almost." "Almost?" he asked, a brow raised in question. "Yes," she said, her expression turning serious, though her eyes still danced. "After all of this, all the stitches and the secrets and the narrow escapes, I have decided you still owe me something." She tapped a finger on his chest. "You owe me a smile. One every morning. Non-negotiable." The wheels of official justice, once set in motion by the collective will of Dry Creek, turned slowly but ground exceedingly fine. Months after Crowley was hauled away in chains, a circuit judge arrived, his carriage kicking up the same red dust that had witnessed the town's turmoil. The trial was a formality. The evidence in the Black Ledger, corroborated by the signed testimony of nearly every citizen, was irrefutable. Silas Crowley and the long list of officials named in his book were found guilty of bribery, conspiracy, and fraud. The verdict from the territorial capital was a landmark decision. The fraudulent mining contract was nullified, and in an unprecedented move that acknowledged the unique circumstances, Copper Pass and its surrounding lands were designated as a community trust, its resources to be managed and shared by all the residents of the valley, Apache included. The law, for once, had bent toward justice. The true changes, however, were not written on paper. They were written in the daily life of the town. A found family, stitched together from disparate threads of culture and experience, had begun to form. It was seen in the way Henry Miller now shared a dipper of water at the well with an Apache elder, discussing the prospects for rain. It was heard in the laughter of children who had forgotten that their games were once separated by an invisible but impassable line. It was felt in the quiet understanding that passed between Rosa Valdez and Reverend Avery, two pillars of a new kind of community. One built not on fear, but on the hard-won courage of its people. They had all learned that justice was not a gift from a distant authority, but a structure you built yourself, plank by plank, with the nails of conviction and the hammer of shared action. They had grown, not by erasing their differences, but by learning to trust, to give, and to make space for one another. One clear, cool afternoon in late autumn, when the sky was a deep, cloudless blue and the air was crisp with the scent of pine, Evelyn and Kohana rode out to Copper Pass. The new bridge was solid beneath their horses' hooves, a sturdy symbol of the town's resilience. They left the horses at the base of the trail and walked to the high overlook where he had once thrown the makeshift bolas to save the Schmidt family. The valley spread out below them, a patchwork of gold and brown, peaceful under the afternoon sun. Evelyn reached into her satchel. She had spent many quiet evenings painstakingly repairing the Thunderbird amulet that Pike's bullet had shattered, using fine sinew and a little fish glue. She had pieced the carved feather back together. It was not perfect. A thin, jagged crack ran through it, a scar that told the story of its trial by fire, but it was whole again. She did not hand it back to him. Instead, she reached up and carefully tied the leather thong to the branch of a hardy, wind-twisted juniper tree that grew from a crevice in the rock. The amulet twisted slowly in the breeze, a guardian now not for one man, but for the pass itself, its promise given back to the land. Then Kohana knelt. From his own pouch, he took the broken piece of the mercenary's spur, the one Evelyn had found in the ashes of the Miller barn. It was a relic of the violence and deceit that had almost torn their world apart. He found a deep crack in the rock face, a small, dark fissure, and he pushed the piece of steel deep inside, burying it in the heart of the mountain. The two opposing symbols, the promise of protection and the instrument of aggression, were now laid to rest. Their conflict resolved and their power neutralized, absorbed by the ancient, patient stone. The first day of the full autumn school term was a day of quiet celebration. Inside the small adobe schoolhouse, The low afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The room was filled with the low hum of children's voices, a sound that was a testament to the town's new hope. At one table, a young boy with blonde hair was carefully explaining the English word for river to a small Apache girl. She, in turn, pointed out the window and taught him the Apache word for mountain. Across the room, the son of a Mexican ranch hand was helping his friend spell a word in Spanish. For the first time, 3 languages echoed within those walls, not in conflict, but in a shared, harmonious pursuit of understanding. It was a new kind of prayer, a proclamation that the future would be a place of many voices. That evening, as twilight settled over the valley, painting the sky in soft shades of lavender and rose, Kohana and Evelyn stood by the town well. The little wooden rooster Evelyn had carved sat proudly on the crossbeam, its silent crow a permanent welcome to the dawn. The frantic, desperate pace of their lives had finally slowed. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that was calm and clear. The feeling was no longer one of flight, but of arrival. They had weathered the hurricane and found their way home. Kohana looked at the woman beside him. He saw not just the Eastern doctor or the courageous rebel, but the person who had shown him a path he never knew existed. His proposal was as simple and unadorned as the man himself. There was no ring, no grand declaration. He just looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a lifetime of unspoken promises. "Will you stay?" he asked, his voice a low, gentle rumble, "and guard the path with me?" It was a question about more than just a place. It was a question about a purpose, a partnership, a shared life built on the foundation of everything they had fought for. Evelyn's answer was just as simple, just as sure. She met his gaze, and in her eyes, he saw the home he had never thought he would find. "I will stay," she said. Later that night, the last light faded from the sky, and a profound peace settled over Dry Creek. The sound of angry shouts and panicked gunfire was a distant memory, replaced now by the gentle, rhythmic whisper of a late-season rain beginning to fall. A sound not of destruction, but of renewal. Kohana stood at the window of the small clinic, looking out at the sleeping town. He saw the soft glow of lanterns in the windows, the dark, solid shapes of the buildings, the new steeple on the rebuilt church. It was not his land. It was not their land. It was a place that belonged to those who had learned the value of keeping a promise. He had learned the lessons that the desert had always tried to teach, that justice is not found, but forged by the hands of witnesses, that love is not a feeling, but an act of courage, and that true harmony is not the act of erasing differences, but of learning to draw water from the same well. Thank you so much for listening to our story. Please comment below where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.